Hebrew numerical constructions. And I'd like to add that Adina has done some incredibly innovative work in many of these areas, and particularly in pragmatic analysis. So Adina is going to talk to us today about the syntax of calendrical year expressions in late biblical Hebrew. Adina, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. I want to thank Nili Samet for inviting me to speak and for organizing this wonderful workshop, and for everybody who helped her, Ronit, her partner Emmanuel Masté. Yes, I'll be talking about calendrical year expressions. Can everybody hear me and see my slideshow?
Yes.
Yes, okay. In this presentation, I will discuss diachronic changes in the syntactic constructions used to express ordinal year expressions, such as the 15th year in late biblical Hebrew. While changes in the syntax of cardinal expressions in late biblical Hebrew have long been the subject of discussion in the scientific literature, the syntactic expression of ordinality in the late period has only recently become a focus of attention. Cardinal and ordinal numerals normally form distinct paradigms with very different semantic and syntactic uses. I will be marking ordinals as blue and cardinals as red throughout this presentation. We see here the structure and interpretation of prototypical temporal phrases featuring cardinal and ordinal numerals. While English cardinal and ordinal phrases have the same word order, 5 boys versus the 5th boy, in biblical Hebrew, they have in most cases opposite word order. Thus, the cardinal phrase Sheva Shanim has a numeral before the noun, while the ordinal phrase Hashana Hashenit, the numeral follows the noun. Cardinal temporal phrases are nearly always indefinite, while ordinal temporal phrases, such as Bayom HaShlishi, are usually definite and governed by a preposition. Cardinal phrases express duration, while ordinal phrases designate an interval on a timeline from an initial reference point. As this slide shows, there is a sharp disparity between the productivity of the cardinal and ordinal paradigms. Biblical Hebrew can generate a cardinal of any size by an appropriate combination of simple numerals and multiples and powers of 10. In English, ordinals of any size can also be generated by adding an appropriate ending to a form of the cardinal. For example, we can take 30 and convert it to 30th. In biblical Hebrew, however, morphological ordinals simply stop at 10th and cannot be combined. How then is the Bible able to express, say, the 38th year of King Asa's reign? As this slide shows, biblical Hebrew compensates for its lack of higher ordinal numerals by using cardinal numerals in special constructions. This phenomenon is known from other languages as well, including Dutch and English. Barbier's 2007 terms these syntactically derived ordinals. The numerical expressions we will be looking at are shown in red to reflect that they involve cardinal numerals, but their translations are in blue to indicate that they have the semantic interpretation of an ordinal phrase. Nearly all such constructions are temporal phrases. 2 of them are shown here. The first, Bishnat 27, consists of a construct phrase with shnat as the head and a cardinal numeral as annex, thus literally the year of 27. It is followed by a it is followed by a prepositional phrase, La'asa Melech Yehuda, specifying the reference point from which 27 years are to be counted off. The meaning is thus, in the 27th year of Asa. The second example has what looks like a durational phrase, Bishnone Esrei Shana, literally in 18 years. But again, here the intended interpretation is ordinal, in the 18th year. As in the previous example, the numerical phrase is followed by a lit phrase specifying the starting point, Lamelech Yoshiyahu, of King Josiah's reign. The standard grammars, such as GKC, Davidson, and Juan Raoka, describe constructions like the ones we have just seen, as displaying variation with respect to the order of the constituents and the use of absolute and construct forms. And Fassberg also discusses this in his recent book on the syntax of Biblical Hebrew. In previous publications, Rothstein and Moshavi 2021 and Moshavi 2020 have shown that these and other cardinal expressions with the same meaning have a number of fixed structures, each with its own characteristic distribution and semantic interpretation. And I would add here that when I started studying these ordinal phrases, I had no intention of connecting it to any diachronic phenomenon. So this, the development in the system kind of came out of the data from what was originally supposed to be simply a syntactic and semantic study. In this presentation, I will try to demonstrate the following. Number one, Biblical Hebrew has several syntactic options for expressing ordinal years, whether over or under 10, and whether calendrical or non-calendrical. Number two, while some of the same constructions can be found in classical Biblical Hebrew and late Biblical Hebrew, their distribution in the late corpus differs dramatically from the classical corpus. And number three, comparing the transitional Biblical Hebrew corpus to the classical and the late periods reveals gradual diachronic changes that resulted in the almost complete dominance of one of the constructions. Finally, we will briefly discuss both internal and external factors that appear to have contributed to these changes. The corpus for this study is drawn from a larger scale study of ordinal expressions in Biblical Hebrew. The corpus is the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, with comparative data drawn from extra biblical and Aramaic texts of the Second Temple period, which we'll briefly discuss towards the end. The biblical corpus contains approximately 218 occurrences of cardinal constructions expressing ordinality. Nearly all temporal expressions involving either explicitly or implicitly one of three nouns, shana, yom, or chodesh. Of these, 112 are year expressions. Data on the 296 occurrences of morphologically ordinal phrases, henceforth MOPS, incorporating one of these three temporal nouns was examined as well. Following Hurwitz, for example, 2013, 2016, and Hornkohl, 2013, 2014, 2016, among others, the biblical books are classified here as belonging to one of three language stages: classical Biblical Hebrew, ending in 586 BCE, transitional Biblical Hebrew from 586 BCE to approximately 450 BCE, and late Biblical Hebrew starting from 450 BCE. I'm listing here only books which happen to have ordinal expressions of the type we're studying today. This paper adopts the viewpoint advocated by Hurwitz and Hornkohl that the Genesis through 2 Kings corpus can be dated on linguistic grounds to the pre-exilic period. While I certainly am not denying that essentially classical texts may contain late editorial headings, glosses, or additions, we will see that this rough classification system nevertheless suffices to reveal striking differences between the classical and the late corpora in the expression of ordinality. The relevant transitional Biblical Hebrew texts include Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Haggai, and Zechariah. These texts exhibit some late Biblical Hebrew features, but on the whole bear a greater resemblance to classical Biblical Hebrew than later Second Temple texts, according to Hornkohl. The last two chapters of 2 Kings, which relate to the final years before the exile and contain parallel passages with Jeremiah 52, are also considered here to be part of the TBH corpus. Finally, the relevant LBH texts are Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. While Chronicles contains many texts with parallels in Kings, and some of these texts are likely to be of pre-exilic origin, close comparison of the passages in the two books, as well as is well known, shows that the late language has left its mark on the Chronicles passages. And we will see that this is true for our topic as well. The translations in the presentation are based primarily on NRSV or NJPS, with adaptations made in order to conform more closely to the Hebrew syntactic structures. And citations from the Dead Sea Scrolls, documents from the Judean Desert, and Elephantine are from morphologically tagged texts accessed through recorded software, as are the biblical passages. Let's start by taking a brief look at each of the 3 cardinal constructions with ordinal meanings that we will be looking at today. And in the beginning, I will be deliberately taking examples from the classical corpus. The first one I termed the reduplicative construct phrase. This structure has a temporal noun in the construct state, followed by a numerical appositional phrase containing the same temporal noun. For example, Bishnat shesh me'ot shana. Thus, literally, the year of 600 years. The reduplicative construct phrase, or RCP, is typically governed by bit and is often modified by a live phrase designating the initial reference point of the sequence. For example, here, the reference point is L'chaye Noach, from the date of Noach's birth. The RCP yields an ordinal interpretation, apparently, by designating the most salient year in a particular temporal sequence. In other words, the year of X years, that is the last year in a sequence of years, following explanation given in Rothstein and Moshavi, 2021, as well as Richard Steiner, Personal Communication. Elaborating on this suggestion, the ordinal interpretation can be said to emerge as a conventionalized pragmatic inference, identifying the year as the last one. While the RCP is composed of syntactic structures in broad use in biblical Hebrew, namely a construct phrase and an appositional phrase, it has no equivalent outside of numerical expressions. Not only that, it cannot be used to express ordinality in any realm other than the temporal. For example, we cannot say shevet shnemasar shevet to mean the 12th tribe, and such a structure would presumably be ungrammatical. The RCP is only used for numbers over 10. It can relate to a contextually evoked reference point, as here, or to a fixed calendar. The RCP is extremely rare in CBH, except for the books of Kings, which we're looking at in a more detail shortly. I believe that it is an archaic remnant of a suppletive ordinal paradigm that preceded more economical and unambiguous ways of designating ordinality. It is hard to imagine it being innovated in a period in which non-repetitive constructions, such as the ones we will discuss, were already available. An indication that the RCP once participated freely with the morphological ordinals in a suppletive ordinal paradigm is shown in this passage from number 7, where the expressions listing the chieftains take the form of mops, or morphologically ordinal phrases, for the 1st through the 10th chieftain, while the 11th and 12th are expressed as RCPs and therefore marked in red because they contain cardinal numerals. This passage is claimed by Milgram, 1986, to be of particularly ancient origin, and it features an ancient form of the numeral for 11, ashteh, which, as Mizrahi 2016 has shown, must go back to Proto-Semitic, despite the fact that it's also used in late biblical Hebrew. So that's construction number 1. The next construction I've termed the appositional phrase, or AP. The appositional phrase has a cardinal in apposition with a temporal noun following it. This is formally identical to a duration phrase, 40 shana. Unlike duration phrases, however, the AP is nearly always governed by bit, although there is one exceptional occurrence without a preposition in Genesis 14:4. Like the RCP, the AP is characteristically modified by a live phrase designating the reference point, although this can be absent when it is retrievable from the prior context. The AP has a syntactic structure, and I believe the literal meaning of a durational phrase, in X years. I would argue that the preposition bit should be interpreted to mean during or within a particular interval of years. And we can compare this to an expression designating a future time, for example, be'od shloshet yamim, meaning on the 3rd day. This designates the final year of a span by conventionalized pragmatic implication. If a person says that a certain event occurred within a span of 27 years from the beginning of a king's realm, it can be inferred that it occurred in the final year, because if it happened on the 10th year, why choose the number 27? A similar phenomenon exists in English. For example, I'll be back in 3 days, which essentially means I will be back on the 3rd day. The AP is restricted to numbers over 10 and is used for years, days, and months in any context, in both calendrical and non-calendrical expressions. The noun is always singular. This is not unexpected because Yom and Shana are normally singular when modified by a numeral over 10. And the same appears to be true of Chodesh, although evidence there is limited. The final construction, called the construct phrase, or CP, is the one which will be our star in late biblical Hebrew. This construction has a singular temporal noun in the construct as head and a cardinal annex. For example, Shnat Shmone Esrei. Noun and cardinal always have matching or non-conflicting gender. Like the previous constructions, the CP is typically governed by bit. Occasionally, it is governed by other prepositions, or rarely by none at all. It is often modified by a lib phrase, or less often by a bit phrase. According to Rothstein and Moshavi, the numeral in the CP designates an abstract entity and not a modifier. The CP is the label or name of a unique interval in a calendrical system and is the equivalent of a proper noun. Thus, Shnat Shmone Esrei means the year of 18, or in more idiomatic English, year 18. The CP, unlike the previous two constructions, is used with numbers under and over 10. And I believe this is an important factor in its development. While the CP makes use of a syntactic structure in broad use throughout the lexicon, namely the construct phrase, its bare numeral annex is unprecedented. It is never used to express ordinality outside of the temporal realm. Thus, there are no expressions like Shevet Chamesh, with the meaning the fifth tribe. This is unlike English, where this structure is highly productive. For example, candidate 5, line 2, stanza 5, table 8. The CP is not found in the classical biblical Hebrew corpus outside of the Book of Kings, and this is also going to be important. We're now ready to contrast the distributional patterns of these three expressions in classical, transitional, and late biblical Hebrew. Most peculiarly, classical biblical Hebrew exhibits two distinct patterns of distribution for the ordinal year constructions, depending on literary context. The first pattern, which we'll actually discuss second, obtains in Regnal accession formulas found only in the Book of Kings. The second pattern is found everywhere else, including non-calendrical expressions, non-regnal years, and regnal years outside of accession formats. Let's look at the ordinary occurrences, leaving aside the synchronistic formulas for now. In general, in CBH, ordinal year constructions are in complementary distribution. Numbers under 10 appear as morphologically ordinal phrases, as in Bashana HaShenit or Bashana HaChamishit. Numbers over 10, with a few exceptions, are APs. Now remember, APs are the ones that are the same as a durational phrase with the number first. For example, Bishmonim Shana ve'arbameot Shana, or Bishmone Esrei Shana. Okay, so the MOPs and the APs form complementary distribution. If we look specifically at the Regnal accession formulas, we see something different. I'm referring here to the synchronistic accession formulas, which date the ascent of a Judean or Israelite king to the throne, with reference to the regnal year of the monarch of the other kingdom. The synchronistic expressions are embedded in accession formulas introducing each king. These formulas come in a few varieties, depending on whether the king is Judean or Israelite, and whether it is a natural accession or a usurper. Whatever the case, we find a strikingly different pattern from the one observed earlier, and I do not claim to have a complete explanation for this phenomenon, but I think it is quite striking. Instead of morphologically ordinal phrases for numbers under 10 and APs for numbers over 10, the synchronistic formulas feature all APs or RCPs. And notice that I already pointed out that RCPs are extremely rare, leaving aside the books of Kings. Not only that, this is the only context in which CPs, the construct phrase, for example, Shnat Chamesh, this is the only place where CPs are found in the classical biblical Hebrew corpus, with rare exceptions. I could not find any pattern governing the selection of an RCP over a CP. Now, as I mentioned, RCPs are never used for numbers under 10, So if the number is under 10, there's only one option, the CP. But if it's over 10, we see that in the majority of cases, it's an RCP with 15 occurrences or 6 occurrences of CPs. Both constructions occur in accession formulas throughout kings, are used with relation to both Judean and Israelite monarchs, and appear in either pre-verbal or post-verbal position in the sentence. It's got stuck somehow. Why? Okay, we see here in a single passage how the selected constructions changes when we go from the accession verse to subsequent events in the king's realm. Okay, and the first citation from 2 Kings 18:1 relates the accession of Hezekiah. And we see there a CP, Bishnat Shalosh. Next, the text relates an event that took place in the 4th year of the king of Hezekiah. And here we have a morphologically ordinal phrase, as expected, Bashana HaRavi'it. Later, an event is related from the 14th year. And here, again, we have, as expected, Uve'arba Esrei Shana with the numeral coming first. So the exceptional pattern here is really the first verse, which has a CP, which is a highly unusual occurrence in CBH, leaving aside this particular literary context. I now present interim conclusions on classical biblical Hebrew with regard to the expression of year ordinality. The standard way of expressing ordinal years is through a suppletive paradigm consisting of morphologically ordinal phrases for numerals 10 and under, and appositional phrases, APs, for numerals over 10. The RCP, leaving aside kings, appears to be an archaism, and it's used here for a very specific literary purpose. I might suggest here that the appearance of the RCP in synchronistic accession formulas may be related to the distinctive genre and sources of these texts. Bin Nun, 1968, argues that the accession passages in Kings were derived from royal king lists, in contrast to the surrounding narratives, which were based on chronicles or annals. In her view, which is certainly not universally accepted, some of the synchronisms were already recorded in the king lists, while others were added by the authors of Kings. I think that this is a promising direction, and I would suggest that as an archaic construction, the RCP is ideally suited to the king list genre, which was compiled to establish the legitimacy of a present ruler by listing him as the latest of a line of kings and demonstrating the antiquity of that line. And given the archaic flavor of the RCP, I think that perhaps it is used for literary reasons here. The CP, on the other hand, appears to be an innovation because it does not appear anywhere else in the CBH corpus. I would suggest that the fact that it only appears in a particular literary formula suggests that it is actually in a literary borrowing and is not part of the language in its natural use. It is most likely, if so, that this was borrowed from Aramaic, because as we'll see soon, this construction is well known from Imperial Aramaic. It is not likely to be Phoenician for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the parallel construction there has a plural temporal noun, which never occurs in Hebrew. Although the CP is undocumented in Aramaic of the First Temple period, this may be simply due to the fact that the Aramaic inscriptions of this period do not contain ordinal year or day expression. We know that Aramaic was already in use in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and that some Judean officials were able to converse in Aramaic in the late 8th century. But it is not improbable that the king lists or the authors of Kings employed at times a construction used in foreign royal lists or archives rather than the traditional RCP. These hypotheses are, of course, speculative and in need of further investigation. Clearly, Kings has a very complex compositional and transmission history. What is important for our purposes is the contrast between the restricted uses of these constructions in Kings as compared to what we will see to be a broader distribution in transitional and late biblical Hebrew. I now turn to transitional biblical Hebrew. We see here a pattern that largely matches what we saw in the classical corpus with some new additions. If we look at non-regnal years, which are nearly all in Ezekiel, we see that the original suppletive pattern is preserved. Any number under 10, 10 and under will be morphologically ordinal, with 5 occurrences, whereas APs are used for numerals over 10, which is the same that we saw in the larger CBH corpus. Now, regnal years are present in the TBH corpus. Note there are no accession formulas because we're not discussing accessions of Judean or Israelite kings. If we look at the regnal years, we have a few RCPs, but they're rare. Mostly we have the same suppletive pattern of morphological ordinals versus APs, but for the first time we have CPs used freely outside of a specific literary context to designate regnal years. And we have a total of 10 of those in the TBH corpus, which as we know is a quite small corpus and without so many occurrences of ordinal numerals. Okay, so here are some examples of uses in the TBH corpus which are in accordance with the classical pattern. Okay, so in the first category we have regnal years from Ezekiel, which all date from the exile of King Yoachim rather than the accession of the king. Okay, so we have Bishloshim Vasheva Shana in the 37th year, Bishloshim Shana, Be'ashtei Asrei Shana. Right, the numeral comes first, which means this is the standard appositional phrase used for numerals over 10. Okay, and this is also used in one case for a regnal year from the last chapter in the Book of Kings, Ad Ashtei Esrei Shana. Okay, so this is a continuous pattern rather than something new. Okay, but here we have a new pattern, which is the standard, becoming more standard use of CPs to designate regnal years, whether they're regnal years of a Judean king, as in the first example, Bishnat Shmone, or whether we're talking about Babylonian or Persian kings. Here we have Bishnat Shmonesre, Bishnat Shtayim, Bishnat Arba. And as we know, this is a standard construction that was used in Aramaic texts to refer to these very same kings. Okay. We also have another even more striking phenomenon. Now, the use of CPs to designate regnal years, as I mentioned, can be found in the classical corpus, but only in a specific literary context. What we do not find anywhere in the classical corpus is the use of CPs to refer to days, as in these examples. Biyom echad, biyom esrim va'arba'a, miyom esrim va'arba'a, biyom esrim va'arba'a. In the classical corpus, I'm not going to get into this in detail, but in the classical corpus, there are 2 constructions used to express days. One of them is simply to use the number by itself. So, for example, be'esrim ve'arba'a lachodesh, meaning the 24th day of the month. Okay. The other pattern is to use an AP, be'esrim ve'arba'a yom lachodesh. But we never have this pattern with the word yom in construct to a following numeral until the transitional corpus. So this is a new development. Okay, so interim conclusions regarding TBH. Okay, the RCP is almost absent. The suppletive morphological ordinal and AP paradigm is still active and used freely in all contexts. And I would also mention that it also occurs occasionally with days and months. The CP, however, is used for the first time to designate regnal years outside of synchronistic accession formulas, and CPs are also used for the first time for ordinal days. I now move on to late biblical Hebrew. Okay. Here we see the same trends that began in TBH taken to a greater degree. In TBH, RCPs, that's the reduplicative ones, right? Bishnat Esrim Shana. In TBH, those were rare. Here they are altogether absent. APs, which were still commonly used, for example, in Ezekiel, in the TBH corpus, have become rare. In regnal years, instead of having mostly morphological ordinals and APs, regnal years are nearly all CPs. Just wait a moment and plug in my computer. My apologies. Okay. Regnal years are nearly all CPs, but occasionally we still find APs and morphological ordinals. Non-regnal years are still designated by morphological ordinals. Now let's take a look in a little more detail. Okay. So I believe that in the late biblical Hebrew corpus, it is justified to call the AP, which has the number first, as a classical relic. There are only 3 occurrences in LBH. They are only in chronicles, in passages describing monarchic era events. So that it is not illogical to assume that this is a relic, this is an expression that was found in a text that was passed down from an earlier period. In addition to this, APs are also rare in day phrases, and they were only found in the classicizing book of Esther, where they may also be deliberate classicizing element. In contrast, the CPs have now become the dominant form for ordinal regular years in all contexts with 28 occurrences. These are just a few of the examples. We have Bishnat Shalosh in Esther, Bishnat Shtayim in Ezra, Mishnat Esrim Va'ad Shnat Shloshim B'Shtayim. So this is in very widespread use. We even find that in parallel passages between Kings and Chronicles, sometimes the CP is substituted for an earlier AP. For example, in 2 Kings 22:3, we have Vahi Bishmoneh Esrei Shana LaMelech Yoshiyahu, which is an AP with a numeral first. In the parallel verse in Chronicles relating the same event, it says Uvishnat Shmoneh Esrei LeMolcho, with the noun and the construct. That would be a construct phrase. An additional example is the verse in 1 Kings 6:1 referring to Bashana HaRevi'it. And in 2 Chronicles 3:2, the same event is described as happening Bishnat Arba. We also have a more widespread use of the CP in ordinal day and month expressions. We have 14 occurrences of day ordinalities with CPs, B'yom Esrim Ve'arba'a, B'yom Esrim Ve'arba'a, also in Nehemiah. And another new development, CPs occur for the first time in month expressions in LBH, the Chodesh Shnei Masar in Esther, although of course, month expressions in LBH are also often referred to by their Babylonian names rather than by numerical designations, and sometimes both are put together. To summarize the diachronic trends that I've presented here, okay, following from classical to late biblical Hebrew in stages, we find that the RCP, which is prominent in over 10 synchronistic accession formulas in CBH, is nearly absent in TBH and entirely absent in LBH. The AP is common in CBH and TBH, right? It's nearly the only option for non-regnal years over 10, but not in common use at all in LBH. The CP has progressively expanded from synchronistic accession formulas to regnal years in any context, and from years only to days and months as well. An open question is whether non-regnal collegnical year expressions could also be designated by CPs. I don't have an answer to that because there simply aren't any occurrences in the LBH corpus. However, its use in day and month expressions suggests that perhaps it could have been used for non-regnal years as well. Although, given the fact that it acts as a proper name, it probably would only have been used in a calendrical context. These figures show the broad outlines of the distributional facts that we've presented here, but it does not show the changes in contextual distribution, so we don't really get the full picture here. But you can see broadly that in the classical period, we have a large number of RCPs and CPs, so those are basically mostly from Kings, and a fair number of APs. In the TBH, the RCPs go down drastically. There are many APs, but this is more a function of the fact that Ezekiel contains a lot of non-regnal years, which are only expressed by APs. And in the late corpus, we see that the CP has nearly taken over entirely. There are no RCPs and very few APs. We can find extra biblical support for these trends by looking at other languages and data from the Second Temple period. Just as the RCP disappears in late biblical Hebrew, it is not in use in biblical or Egyptian Aramaic. It is absent from Dead Sea Scroll Hebrew except in biblical citations, and it is also absent in the Judean desert documents. The obsolescence of the AP in LBH is also mirrored in these extra biblical sources. The AP, Bishmonim Shana, is not in use in biblical or Egyptian Aramaic. It is again extremely rare in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except for citations and reworkings of biblical verses, and it is also absent from the Judean desert documents. In contrast, the dominance of the CPs is mirrored in the extra biblical sources. The CPs are standard in regnal year expressions in biblical and Egyptian Aramaic, where it is also found in day expressions. It is used in Sunday expressions in Dead Sea Scroll Hebrew. And in the Judean desert documents, we see here the CP used consistently in calendrical years, and notably, the Judean desert documents do not use a regnal year system. So we see here CP, clear proof that it was used outside of the regnal calendar. A few examples, okay? In biblical Aramaic, there are only a handful of cardinal temporal expressions with ordinal meaning, but those that are there are all CPs, including 5-year expressions referencing a regnal year calendar. For example, Bishnat Chada Level Shatzar, or Ad Shnat Tartei Lemalchut Daryavesh. And there's also a day expression that's also a CP, Ad Yom Tlata, Hi Shnat Shesh. In Egyptian Aramaic, there are many occurrences of this structure, assuming that the numerical cipher represents a cardinal numeral, which certainly seems very likely. If that's the case, this is identical to the CP, Shnat followed by the number. The CP is also common in day expressions in Egyptian Aramaic, while months, of course, are designated by the Babylonian names. I'll finish up just with a brief discussion of the factors that may have contributed to the dominance of the CP in late biblical Hebrew. A strength of the CP is that it can be used consistently throughout the ordinal paradigm, both 10 and under, over 10 and under 10. For example, we can say Bishnat Arba L'malchuto, and we could say Bishnat Shloshim V'Tesha. Although one might think that we could do the same thing with the AP, that's actually not the case. Remember, the AP has a singular noun following the numeral, Esrim Shana. If we were to use the AP for numerals under 10, which only occurs in one case in the Bible, the noun would have to be in the plural, because the words Shana and Yom appear in the singular only for numerals over 10. So for example, in this verse from Chronicles, we have a very exceptional occurrence of an AP for a number under 10, and it says, Uvishmoneh Shanim. Later on, there's an AP for over 10, which is the normal Uvet Shtemeseh Shana. Therefore, there is no way to have complete consistency throughout the ordinal paradigm with the AP, whereas the CP presents no difficulties in this regard. So that would be an internal factor. Of course, I think the external factor is very important. And the CP, which I'm claiming already existed as a literary borrowing in CBH, was reinforced in LBH by language contact with Aramaic and by adoption of the very same Babylonian and Persian regnal calendrical system in which CPs were standardly used. And finally, standardization of the CP in the function of expressing years is a step towards simplification of the system of expressing calendrical ordinality. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Adina, for a paper full of great detail and very clearly laid out and very important diachronic pathway you found there. If anybody would like to ask questions, please send me a message in the chat or raise your hand. I can, I'm now Carl Young, who raised his hand, please.
Thank you, Professor Moshavi. That was really helpful. I am wondering, I know the study was primarily on expressions per year, and yet the inclusion of Chodesh and Yom helped highlight that the productivity of the expression, the different phrases just wondering, was there, no pun intended, but was there, was Shavua not included due to time limitations, or did you?
No, I don't believe there are any. In other words, Susan Rothstein and I, when we initially started this project, we reviewed all of the occurrences of cardinal numerals with ordinal interpretations, and did not find any except for those 3 temporal words. And we also didn't find any outside of the temporal realm, which was kind of interesting. So I don't remember offhand if there are ordinal phrases with Shavua. Probably there are, but if there weren't any that used cardinals, so that was not the subject of this study. And I would also just mention that the data on Yom was published in 2020 in Journal for Semitics. So I presented a more detailed look at day expressions in that publication.
Hanan Ariel, yeah, has a question.
Thank you, Adina. I wonder if you can say something about the dates in the Samaria Ostraka.
Okay, so I know you have a couple of examples of something that turns up in the Bible, in the Kri and the Ktiv. You have the Shnat Tachi'it, where it's a morphologically ordinal phrase, which would be expected to have the noun in the absolute form, and instead it's in the construct form. So I know that there are a number of those in the Samaria Ostraka. There are also, I believe, ordinary morphologically ordinal phrases. But I don't believe that there are any CPs. I don't think that there are any with cardinal numerals of the type. Do you have one in mind that you think of?
There is a Beshat or Bashat Ha-15 and Beshat or Bashat 15.
Okay.
So maybe it's relevant.
Right. Okay. So I'll have to take a closer look at them. But I would just note that the Beshat Ha, we don't have that. That's extremely rare in the Bible. Only 1 or 2 occurrences. And in the CP, there is no definite article. So there are, in addition to the 3 constructions that I discussed today, there are also about 5 or 6 other ones that are very rare that have to be added to this discussion, but there wasn't enough data to do anything with them. And I don't remember in the scenario Ostraka if they all have the hay or only some of them. But again, I didn't find that it really contributed much to the general picture that we're seeing here. And certainly was not similar to the Elephantine documents later on, which are very consistent in using the CP, the Shnat.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
If nobody else has got any questions, can I just ask a quick question, Adina, about these RCPs and accession formulas? You have this.
I'm open to suggestions.
Well, I mean, you have this redundancy, right? And I wonder whether you considered, the issues of discourse structuring and issues of, what I call heavy coding for marking boundaries of discourse. I mean, it's a sort of like, obviously a clear boundary in the discourse and accession. Is that a fact, do you think? Or do you think it's I think you said you think it's copying some kind of formula. Was this a formula or something you were thinking about?
So there are a few different patterns, but in the accession of each king is described by a number of sentences, right? In the year of X, Y came to the throne, he was X years old, he reigned for X years. So there is a theory that those formulas are from king lists rather than the royal archives. However, many people believe that the king list did not have the synchronisms, because if you're describing the reigns of the kings in your kingdom, why would you want to mention the other king from the other kingdom? On the other hand, Shoshana bin Nun suggests that maybe some of these king lists did have the synchronisms included, and the synchronisms are, of course, the part that has the ordinal year expressions. I think that you're absolutely right that these formulas do form the beginning of a new discourse structure. I think that the fact that it is a very heavy redundant expression, I think it gives dignity and weight to the narrative that's being begun. So I think that you could probably put these things are not contradictory. In other words, it could also have a discourse function, but it could also be used as an archaism, perhaps as well.
Thank you very much. And so we have Eliska Novakova's hand raised.
Thank you. Thank you, Adina, for the presentation. And I just wanted to ask if you see any potential of research into whether the phrase as such, be it RCP or AP, appears at the beginning of the sentence or at the end of the sentence. Because that is a factor that you did not mention, but I guess there probably might be some discourse implication. Thank you.
Interesting. I didn't find any such patterns. I'm not saying it's impossible, but what emerged from the data was really the diachronic distinctions rather than a syntactic distinction in terms of where we find each construction. So I don't believe that that's related, but of course, it's certainly worthy of another look. So, yeah, thank you.
Maria-Elena.
Actually, I have a question for Professor Tamarzi. Okay, do you think that there may be a relationship between the increase in of hine, meaning if, and the decrease of hine, which means behold in late biblical Hebrew?
Well, it should be checked. I don't know. It should be checked. I'll leave it to you, perhaps.
Yeah.
Work on it.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you.
Good.
Okay. Can I relate to Tanya's question?
There's another one. Sorry, I can't see a hand.
Yeah, I put it in the chat.
Ah, sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Go ahead.
I asked Adina whether this reduplicated formula that she has demonstrated, and she guessed it's a kind of archaism, perhaps it can be understood as a mixture, combination of two other formulas of CP and of AP formula.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I don't know why you would want, I don't know why a person would want to combine two formulas that work fine on their own and make something that is so heavy in terms of its linguistic weight. However, Susan Rothstein was convinced that the RCP is actually what underlies some of the AP, and that the AP should be interpreted as if it has an omitted initial noun. In other words, Shnat Esrim Shana, if you leave out the first part, it turns into Esrim Shana. So one of the results that I didn't have a chance to discuss here, but I believe that the diachronic development here proves that the AP is not simply a shortened version of the RCP, at least not on the synchronic level, because the RCP and the AP have completely different distributions, and the AP continues in use much farther along than the other one. So I'm convinced that each of these three constructions is actually an independent construction. As far as the historical development, there certainly could seem to be a relation between them, although I would probably rather say the opposite of the order you suggested, that that the RCP got shortened rather than saying that the RCP is a mixture of two of the others. But of course, it's hard to prove these things definitively.
Okay, I think we better start to wrap up there. After that very interesting